The water bill came 3 weeks before everything went to hell, and I remember staring at the number on the statement thinking it had to be a mistake. I just moved into my new house in Paradise Valley, Arizona, 6 months earlier, and this particular bill was less than half what my neighbors were supposedly paying. That's when I realized my irrigation system was working even better than I'd thought. My name is Zimmerman, and I work as an environmental engineer for a consulting firm in Phoenix. When I bought the property at 4782 Desert Rose Drive, I knew exactly what I was getting into. The house itself was nice but not spectacular. What caught my attention was the land and the previous owner's engineering project that most people had completely overlooked. The property sat on a natural underground spring. Not a huge one, but enough that the previous owner, an old geologist named Frank, had installed a sophisticated collection and irrigation system that fed entirely from that spring. It was brilliant, legal, and according to Arizona water law, entirely mine to use since it originated on my property. I'd spent the first few months after moving in upgrading Frank's system. I replaced old pipes, installed new sprinkler heads, added smart controllers, and even put in a small filtration system. The spring produced roughly 1,500 gallons per day, which was more than enough for my 2-acre lot with its carefully maintained desert landscaping and vegetable garden. I was living the dream, honestly. Low water bills, lush property, and the satisfaction of using a sustainable resource. Then Patricia Hendricks came knocking. It was a Saturday morning in late March when I heard the aggressive rapping on my front door. I'd been working in my garage, organizing tools, and wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I found a woman in her late 40s standing there with a clipboard, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit despite the Arizona heat, her blonde hair sprayed into submission, and an expression that suggested she just caught me committing a felony. "Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew exactly who I was. "That's me. Can I help you?" "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Desert Rose Estates Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your water usage." I leaned against the door frame, already getting a bad feeling about where this was going. "My water usage. Is there a problem?" She glanced down at her clipboard with a dramatic flair. "Several of your neighbors have noticed that your property remains unusually green despite the drought restrictions we've all been following. Some have expressed concerns about whether you're adhering to the community watering schedule." "I am following the schedule," I said, which was technically true. The HOA guidelines stated when irrigation could run. They didn't specify what water source had to be used, and I wasn't violating any time restrictions. "Then perhaps you can explain why your lawn and gardens look so much healthier than everyone else's." I should have just left it there, should have given her some vague answer and sent her on her way. But I was proud of my system, and I'd worked hard to get it running perfectly. "I have an irrigation system fed by a natural spring on my property. It's completely legal and doesn't draw from the municipal supply." Patricia's eyes widened slightly, and I watched something shift in her expression. It wasn't relief or happiness that I was being environmentally conscious. It was something else entirely, something that looked a lot like opportunity. "A spring on your property, that's right. The previous owner installed the collection system years ago. I've just been maintaining and improving it." She wrote something on her clipboard, nodding slowly. "I see. Well, that's very interesting, Mr. Zimmerman. Very interesting indeed. I'm sure the board will want to discuss this at our next meeting." "Discuss what? I'm not doing anything wrong." "No one said you were," she replied, but her smile was the kind that made my engineering instincts scream danger. "We'll be in touch." She left, and I stood there watching her walk back to her white Lexus, feeling like I just made a serious tactical error. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the feeling, but it stuck with me like Arizona dust on a car. 4 days later, I received a formal letter from the Desert Rose Estates, HOA. It was delivered by certified mail, which should have been my first clue that things were about to get messy. I signed for it on my lunch break and opened it in my truck before heading back to work. The letter was 2 pages of legal-sounding language that basically boiled down to this. The HOA board had determined that my underground spring was a community resource since it existed within the boundaries of the HOA-governed neighborhood. As such, they were requesting that I share access to the irrigation system with neighboring properties, specifically those directly adjacent to mine and any others that the board deemed would benefit from this shared amenity. I read it 3 times, certain I was missing something. They wanted me to give my neighbors access to my private water source, the water that came from my property, that I'd spent thousands of dollars upgrading and maintaining. The letter went on to say that failure to comply with this request would result in fines starting at $500 per week, escalating to higher amounts if I continued to refuse. They cited several HOA covenants about community cooperation and equitable distribution of resources, and something about maintaining uniform property standards. I called my real estate attorney that same afternoon. James Wilson had handled my home purchase, and while he mainly dealt with property transactions, he knew enough about HOA law to give me a preliminary assessment. I sat in his office the next evening, the letter spread out on his desk between us. "This is one of the more creative interpretations of HOA authority I've seen," James said, reading through the letter again with his reading glasses perched on his nose. "And by creative, I mean completely legally unfounded. So I don't have to comply. Lucas, let me be very clear. That spring is on your property. You own the water rights. Arizona is a complicated state when it comes to water law, but in this case, it's pretty straightforward. Groundwater that originates on your property belongs to you. The HOA has absolutely no legal authority to demand you share it." Relief washed over me. "So I just ignore this," James frowned, taking off his glasses. "Here's the thing. You should draft a response refusing their demand and citing the actual law. I can help you with that. But I need to warn you, HOAs can make your life very difficult even when they are in the wrong. They can't legally fine you for this, but they might try. They might look for other violations, real or manufactured. It can get ugly. Let them try," I said, feeling my stubbornness kick in. "I'm not giving up my water rights because some HOA president has a power trip." James nodded slowly. "Okay, then let's draft that response and make it very clear where you stand. And Lucas, document everything from here on out. Every interaction, every letter, every conversation. If this escalates, you'll want a paper trail." We spent the next hour crafting a response letter. It was professional but firm, citing Arizona Revised Statutes Title 45 regarding water rights, explaining that the spring was entirely on my property, and making it clear that I would not be sharing access to my private irrigation system. James made sure to note that any fines levied against me for this refusal would be contested, and that I was prepared to take legal action if necessary. I sent the letter via certified mail the next morning and tried to get back to normal life. For about a week, things were quiet. My spring kept flowing, my irrigation system kept working, and my property looked great. I actually started to think that maybe Patricia and her board had accepted my refusal and moved on. Then the fine started. The first notice arrived exactly 8 days after I sent my response letter. $500 for failure to comply with community resource sharing requirements. I immediately forwarded it to James, and he sent another letter to the HOA, this time more forcefully stating that the fines were illegal and that I would not be paying them. The HOA's response came from their attorney, some guy named Richard Carr who worked for a firm that apparently specialized in HOA representation. His letter was full of threatening language about how I'd signed the HOA covenants when I purchased the property, and how those covenants gave the board broad authority to manage community resources. He claimed that since my property was within the HOA boundaries, anything that could be classified as a community amenity fell under their jurisdiction. It was complete garbage legally, but it meant they were digging in. James filed a motion for declaratory judgment with the Maricopa County Superior Court, essentially asking a judge to rule on whether the HOA had any authority over my water source. He assured me this would eventually get resolved in my favor, but that it would take time. Court cases always did. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood started getting weird. Patricia Hendricks began what I can only describe as a campaign of petty harassment. I'd come home from work to find notices on my door about alleged violations. My trash cans were 2 inches too far from the curb. My front door wreath wasn't in approved HOA colors. The tree in my front yard supposedly needed trimming, even though I'd had a certified arborist confirm it was healthy and properly maintained. Each notice came with a fine. $50 here, $75 there. I documented each one, took photos proving the alleged violations weren't actually violations, and forwarded everything to James. He was building quite the file, but the real pressure came from my neighbors. I'd gotten along fine with most of them before all this started. Tom and Sarah Mitchell lived to my right, a nice couple in their 60s who'd always waved when they saw me. The Johnsons lived to my left, a younger family with 3 kids who I'd sometimes see playing in their yard. Across the street were the Patels, quiet professionals who kept to themselves mostly. After the HOA started pushing the community resource angle, everything changed. I was checking my mail one evening when Tom Mitchell walked over. His friendly demeanor was gone, replaced with something cold and resentful. "You know, Lucas, the rest of us are struggling with our water bills," he said without preamble. "Meanwhile, you've got your own private spring and won't share. That seems pretty selfish." I stared at him. "Tom, it's my property. I paid for the system upgrades. The water comes from my land. It's under all our properties, probably. Water doesn't just stay in one place underground. Actually, the Geological Survey says otherwise. It's a localized spring fed by a specific aquifer formation that's only under my lot. That's why Frank bought this particular property 30 years ago." Tom's jaw tightened. "Patricia says you're violating community standards. Patricia is wrong. And she's breaking the law by trying to force me to give up my property rights." "Your property rights?" Tom's voice rose. "What about being a good neighbor? What about community? We all have to live here together." "Being a good neighbor doesn't mean giving up something I own because the HOA president decided she wants it," I shot back. "Would you give Patricia the keys to your car if she said it was a community resource? That's not the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing." Tom walked away shaking his head, and I noticed curtains moving in several windows along the street. People were watching. The HOA was succeeding in turning me into the neighborhood villain. The next day, I found my sprinkler heads vandalized. Someone had smashed 3 of them with what looked like a hammer, leaving broken plastic and flooding water in my front lawn. I shut off the system, took extensive photos and video, and filed a police report. The officer who took the report was sympathetic but realistic. Without witnesses or video of who did it, there's not much we can investigate. You might want to consider installing security cameras. I spent that weekend installing a comprehensive security system. Cameras covering every angle of my property, motion-activated lights, the works. It cost me almost $3,000, but I wasn't going to let vandals destroy my system. The cameras proved to be a wise investment. 2 nights later, at just past midnight, my motion alerts went off. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed to see someone in dark clothing creeping across my front lawn toward my irrigation control box. I immediately called 911 while watching the figure try to pry open the locked metal box that housed my system's main controls. The police arrived within 6 minutes, which was impressively fast. The would-be vandal tried to run but didn't make it far. When the officers walked him back past my front door in handcuffs, I recognized him. Brett Thompson, the 19-year-old son of another HOA board member, Deanne Thompson. The officer took my statement and the video footage from my cameras. Brett was charged with attempted criminal damage and trespassing. When his mother showed up at the police scene, she immediately started screaming about how I was ruining the neighborhood, and her son was just trying to help the community. The officers were not impressed with that defense. The incident with Brett should have been a wake-up call for the HOA to back off, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. At the next HOA board meeting, which I attended specifically to confront them, Patricia stood before the gathered homeowners and painted me as an uncooperative troublemaker who was hoarding resources while my neighbors suffered. Mr. Zimmerman has access to hundreds of gallons of water per day, while the rest of us face drought restrictions and high bills, she announced to the room of about 40 people. He's refused repeated reasonable requests to share this community resource. This kind of selfish behavior undermines everything we're trying to build here in Desert Rose Estates. I stood up from my seat. I'd like to respond to that. Patricia's smile was thin. You're not on the agenda, Mr. Zimmerman. You just spent 5 minutes talking about me. I think I have a right to respond. Several people in the audience murmured agreement. James had advised me to stay calm and stick to facts if I attended the meeting, so I took a breath and did exactly that. The spring on my property is a natural water source that exists only under my lot. I've had it surveyed and certified. Under Arizona law, I own the rights to that water. The HOA has no legal authority to demand I share my private property, which is what my irrigation system is. Would any of you accept the HOA demanding you share your swimming pool, your garage, your backyard? This is no different. Water is different, Patricia countered. Water is essential. It's a community resource. Municipal water is a community resource which we all pay for and share. My private spring water is not, and if you disagree, you're welcome to take it up in court where you'll lose. A hand went up in the audience. It was Sarah Mitchell. But Lucas, wouldn't sharing help the community? Wouldn't it be the right thing to do, Sarah? I'm not stopping anyone from drilling their own well or finding their own water source if they have one on their property. What I'm refusing to do is give up my property rights because it's convenient for the HOA. If I give in on this, what's next? What other private property will the board decide is a community resource? I could see some people nodding, actually considering my point, but Patricia wasn't having it. This discussion is tabled, she announced sharply. We have other business to attend to. Mr. Zimmerman, you'll be hearing from our attorney. I left that meeting knowing this wasn't going to end peacefully. Patricia had too much invested in her position now, too much pride wrapped up in winning this fight. She'd turned it into a crusade, and people like that didn't back down easily. The next escalation came in the form of an attempted lien on my property. James called me at work 3 weeks later, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Lucas, they've filed paperwork attempting to place a lien on your property for unpaid fines. The total they're claiming you owe is over $8,000. $8,000? For what?" "Every fake violation they've cited, plus the water sharing fine increasing weekly. They're trying to force your hand by threatening your property ownership." My grip tightened on my phone. "Can they do that?" "Not legally, no. The fines are baseless, which means the lien is invalid. But we need to fight it formally, which means more court filings. Lucas, this is getting expensive and time-consuming. Are you sure you want to keep fighting?" I looked out my office window at the Phoenix skyline, thinking about my property, my rights, and the principle of the thing. "Yeah, I'm sure. They're bullies, James. If I give in, they'll just do this to someone else down the line." "Okay, then we fight. But I'm going to recommend we also file a counterclaim for harassment and abuse of HOA authority. We might be able to get the current board removed and recover your legal fees." "Do it." The legal battle intensified over the next 2 months. James filed our counterclaim, which included all the documented harassment, the invalid fines, the attempted lien, and even connected Brett Thompson's attempted vandalism to the larger pattern of HOA intimidation. We also filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which had an HOA oversight division that investigated complaints about board misconduct. Patricia and her board responded by ramping up their own campaign. They sent letters to all neighborhood residents claiming I was preventing them from accessing life-sustaining water resources. They organized what they called a community awareness meeting that was really just a platform to demonize me. They even tried to organize a petition demanding I comply with their water-sharing demands. But cracks were starting to show in their support. I was working in my front yard one Saturday morning when Susan Patel crossed the street and approached me. She looked nervous, glancing back at her house as if worried someone was watching. "Lucas, I wanted to apologize," she said quietly. "My husband and I signed that petition Patricia was circulating, but we've been reading about the actual law, and I don't think she's right about this." I straightened up from the garden bed I'd been weeding. "I appreciate you saying that, Susan. She's been very persuasive, making it sound like you're the bad guy. But if you own the water rights, you own them. I wouldn't want someone forcing me to share my property either." She hesitated. "A few of us have been talking. We think Patricia has gone too far with this whole thing." That was encouraging, but I didn't want to get my hopes up. "Well, it'll all get settled in court eventually. That's what worries some people. If the HOA loses, we all have to pay for their legal fees through our dues. Patricia hasn't been very transparent about how much this is all costing." That was an angle I hadn't fully considered. Every dollar the HOA spent fighting me was coming from the collective dues of all homeowners. Patricia was gambling with everyone's money to pursue her vendetta. The next day, I found a note in my mailbox. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting looked feminine and careful. "Mr. Zimmerman, you should know that Patricia has been meeting with a developer named Carson Mitchell who wants to buy several properties in the neighborhood. She's been telling him about the spring and suggesting the HOA could guarantee access to it for new development. Some of us think she's getting kickbacks. Thought you should know." I immediately forwarded a photo of the note to James. If Patricia was trying to leverage my water source for personal profit, that was a serious conflict of interest and potentially criminal. James hired a private investigator to look into Patricia's connection with this Carson Mitchell. What we found was damning. Carson Mitchell owned Mitchell Development Group, a mid-sized real estate development company that specialized in luxury housing. He'd been quietly buying up properties in and around Desert Rose Estates for the past year. Patricia's husband, Roger Hendricks, worked for an architecture firm that had received 3 contracts from Mitchell Development Group in the past 18 months, totaling over $400,000 in fees. The private investigator also discovered that Patricia had been in regular communication with Carson Mitchell, including several lunch meetings and phone calls. While nothing explicitly illegal had been found yet, it painted a clear picture of potential corruption. Patricia was trying to force me to share my water source so she could promise access to it to a developer who was enriching her family. James presented all of this to the Arizona Department of Real Estate's HOA Oversight Division. They opened a formal investigation into Patricia and the Desert Rose Estates HOA board. That's when things really fell apart for Patricia. The investigation became known in the neighborhood within days. I don't know who leaked it, but suddenly everyone was talking about Patricia's potential corruption. The homeowners who'd supported her began demanding answers. An emergency HOA meeting was called, which I attended with James beside me. The community room at the neighborhood clubhouse was packed. Every seat was filled and people lined the walls. Patricia sat at the board table looking composed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. One of the homeowners, a retired attorney named George Franklin, stood up before Patricia could even call the meeting to order. "Patricia, before we begin, I'd like to know if it's true that you've been in contact with a developer about properties in this neighborhood while simultaneously pursuing this water-sharing issue with Mr. Zimmerman." The room went dead quiet. Patricia's face flushed. "My personal communications are none of your concern, George. They are when you're using your position as HOA president to potentially benefit yourself financially," George shot back. "They're especially our concern when you're spending our collective dues on a legal battle that appears to be motivated by profit rather than community interest." Other voices joined in, people demanding answers, wanting to know how much had been spent on legal fees, questioning the validity of the fines against me. It was chaos, and Patricia was losing control of the room. Finally, she stood up, her voice shaking with either anger or fear. I couldn't tell which. "I have done everything in my power to protect this community and ensure fair access to resources. If you people can't see that, if you're going to side with someone who hoards water while his neighbors struggle, then maybe I'm not the problem here." "The investigation says otherwise," James spoke up calmly. "The state is currently reviewing evidence that you've been attempting to leverage HOA authority for personal gain. That's corruption, Miss Hendricks, and it's illegal." Patricia gathered her papers with shaking hands. "I don't have to listen to this. I resign, effective immediately." She walked out of the room, and the silence she left behind was stunned. The 3 other board members looked at each other in confusion. Finally, one of them, a mild-mannered accountant named Paul Rodriguez, spoke up. "I think we need to call for an emergency board election and a full financial audit of what's been spent on this legal matter." The motion was seconded and passed unanimously by the remaining board members. Over the next 3 weeks, the truth came out in pieces. The financial audit revealed that Patricia had spent over $40,000 of HOA funds on legal fees related to the water dispute with me. She'd authorized the spending without full board approval, which violated the HOA's own bylaws. The state investigation uncovered emails between Patricia and Carson Mitchell, discussing how access to my spring could increase property values for his planned development. While no money had directly changed hands between them, the coordination between Patricia's actions and her husband's contracts with Mitchell's company constituted a clear conflict of interest. The Arizona Attorney General's office got involved, and Patricia Hendricks was ultimately charged with misuse of HOA funds and abuse of authority. Roger Hendricks was also investigated for his firm's dealings with Mitchell Development, though no criminal charges were filed against him. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency meeting, immediately dropped all fines against me and issued a formal apology. They also voted to reimburse me for my legal fees from the HOA's reserve fund, which amounted to about $32,000 by that point. But the story wasn't quite over. Carson Mitchell, seeing his plans falling apart, tried one last desperate move. He approached me directly one evening, pulling up to my house in an expensive Mercedes and knocking on my door with a smile that was probably meant to be charming, but came across as oily. "Mr. Zimmerman, I'm Carson Mitchell. I was hoping we could talk business." I leaned against my doorframe, already not liking where this was going. "What kind of business?" "I'd like to make you an offer for your property. A generous offer, well above market value. Say $850,000. My property was worth maybe $500,000 tops." "Why would you pay that much?" "Because I'm developing several nearby lots and having access to your spring would be valuable to my project. If you sold to me, everyone wins. You make a nice profit, I get what I need for development." "So you're trying to buy what Patricia couldn't force me to give up." His smile didn't waver. "I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial transaction. I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Mitchell. I like my home, and I'm not interested in helping you profit after you tried to use a corrupt HOA president to steal my water rights." The smile finally cracked. "That's a serious accusation. It's a factual statement. The Attorney General seems to think so too, based on their investigation. Now, if you'll excuse me." I closed the door on his protests and watched through my window as he drove away, his Mercedes kicking up dust. The legal proceedings against Patricia took several months to work through the system. She ultimately pleaded guilty to misuse of HOA funds and abuse of authority in exchange for probation, community service, and restitution to the HOA. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Arizona. Brett Thompson, for his attempted vandalism of my irrigation system, received a plea deal that gave him probation and community service as well, being a first-time offender. Deanne Thompson, his mother and Patricia's ally on the old board, quietly resigned from the neighborhood and moved to Scottsdale. As for Carson Mitchell, his development plans fell apart without access to my water source. The properties he'd purchased sat undeveloped, and I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that he eventually sold them at a loss and moved his operations to Nevada. Life in Desert Rose Estates gradually returned to normal, though it was a new kind of normal. The experience had shaken the community's complacency about HOA authority. The new board implemented transparency requirements, spending limits that required homeowner votes, and clear conflict of interest policies. They also formally acknowledged in the HOA bylaws that private water sources on individual properties were not subject to HOA authority, hopefully preventing any future boards from trying what Patricia had attempted. My relationship with my neighbors slowly improved. Tom and Sarah Mitchell apologized for how they'd treated me, admitting they'd been swept up in Patricia's rhetoric without really understanding the legal and ethical issues at stake. The Johnsons invited me to a barbecue, which was their way of extending an olive branch. Susan Patel and her husband became genuine friends, often stopping by to see how my garden was doing. I even helped a few neighbors explore whether they had any underground water sources on their own properties. Tom Mitchell actually found a smaller spring on his lot, and with my advice, installed his own modest irrigation system. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The whole ordeal taught me a lot about standing up for your rights, even when it's difficult and unpopular. It would have been easier to give in to Patricia's demands, to share my water source just to keep the peace. But easy isn't always right. Property rights matter. The rule of law matters. And while community cooperation is important, it can't come at the expense of individual rights and legal boundaries. My irrigation system still runs perfectly, fed by my spring, watering my 2 acres of desert landscaping and vegetable gardens. Every time I see those sprinklers running, I think about what I almost lost and what I fought to keep. Not just the water, but the principle that your property is yours, and no amount of social pressure or corrupt authority should be able to take it from you. I still live at 4782 Desert Rose Drive in Paradise Valley, Arizona. My water bill is still low, my garden still thrives, and my property rights remain intact. The spring flows at about 1,500 gallons per day, just as it always has, a natural resource that I maintain, protect, and use responsibly. And if another HOA president ever shows up at my door with a clipboard and demands that I share it, well, I've got a very good lawyer on speed dial and a thick file of case law that says they can go pound sand. The experience did something else too. It got me involved in HOA reform advocacy at the state level. I testified before the Arizona legislature about HOA overreach and the need for better oversight and homeowner protections. Some of my suggestions, based on my experience, were actually incorporated into a new law that passed 2 years after my battle with Patricia. The law now requires HOAs to get independent legal opinions before pursuing certain types of enforcement actions, creates stronger penalties for board members who abuse their authority, and establishes clearer guidelines about what HOAs can and cannot regulate. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction, and I'm proud to have played a small part in it. James Wilson, my attorney, still jokes that my case was one of the most satisfying of his career. We've stayed in touch, and he's referred several other homeowners to me for advice when they've faced similar HOA overreach situations. I'm happy to help. Nobody should have to go through what I went through just to protect what's legally theirs. Looking back, I sometimes think about how different things might have been if I just caved to Patricia's initial demand. My system could have been overloaded by neighbors using it, probably breaking down from the increased demand. I'd have been responsible for maintaining it for everyone's benefit while receiving nothing in return. My spring might have even dried up from overuse, destroying the very resource everyone was fighting over. Instead, my system runs efficiently, serving its intended purpose for the property it was designed for. I've actually used it as a model for consulting work my firm does on sustainable water management in residential settings. We've designed similar spring-fed systems for other properties where geological conditions allow for it, always making sure the legal water rights are properly secured first. The security cameras I installed during the conflict are still in place. I've thought about taking them down now that things are peaceful, but they've proven useful for general security and package delivery monitoring. Plus, they're a reminder to stay vigilant. Peace is good, but preparedness is better. One unexpected benefit of the whole situation was that it forced me to really understand Arizona water law in depth. I've since gotten additional certifications in water rights consulting, which has opened up new professional opportunities. Fighting for my rights made me an expert in an area I might never have explored otherwise. The neighborhood itself has changed in subtle ways. There's a stronger sense of community now, but it's based on mutual respect rather than HOA-enforced conformity. People are more engaged with board decisions, actually showing up to meetings and voting on important issues. The shadow of Patricia's corruption made everyone more aware and involved, which is ultimately healthy even if the lesson was painful. I've even started a small neighborhood newsletter, distributed digitally to anyone who wants to subscribe. It covers local issues, upcoming board meetings, and general interest stories about the community. It's entirely independent of the HOA, which some people appreciate. It's a way to keep everyone informed without filtering everything through board-approved channels. My garden has become something of a neighborhood attraction. People stop by sometimes to see what I'm growing, ask for gardening advice, or just chat about sustainable landscaping in the desert. I've given away hundreds of pounds of tomatoes, peppers, and squash from my vegetable garden over the years. It's become a way to build goodwill and community in a much more organic way than any HOA mandate could achieve. The spring itself has been remarkably consistent. I monitor its flow rate regularly as part of my engineering habits, and it's varied less than 10% over the years I've owned the property. The aquifer that feeds it must be quite stable, which supports the geological survey findings that it's a distinct formation isolated to my property. It's a little slice of natural abundance in the middle of the desert, and I don't take it for granted. I've also made sure to maintain Frank's original vision for the property. The old geologist who first installed the collection system had a respect for the land and a commitment to working with nature rather than against it. I've tried to honor that by keeping the desert landscaping natural, using native plants, and ensuring the irrigation system doesn't waste a drop. The spring gives, and I use what it gives responsibly. It's a balance that feels right. Every year on the anniversary of the day Patricia first knocked on my door, I pour myself a glass of spring water, sit on my back patio, and reflect on the journey. It's become a personal tradition, a way to remember what I fought for and why it mattered. The water is cool and clean, tasting faintly of the minerals it picked up flowing through underground rock. It's the taste of home, of rights defended, of battles won. My story spread beyond just my neighborhood. Local news picked it up during Patricia's trial, and it became something of a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. I did a few interviews, always emphasizing the importance of knowing your rights and standing up for them. Several other homeowners reached out to me with their own HOA horror stories, and I helped where I could, connecting them with James or other attorneys who specialized in HOA law. The whole experience made me appreciate the legal system, for all its flaws. It took time, it cost money, but ultimately justice prevailed. The courts recognized property rights over HOA overreach, corrupt officials were held accountable, and reforms were enacted. The system worked the way it's supposed to, though it required persistence and resources that not everyone has. That's actually become another cause for me. I've worked with legal aid organizations to help homeowners who are facing HOA abuse but can't afford private attorneys. I've provided expert testimony pro bono in several cases, and I've donated to funds that help cover legal costs for homeowners fighting unjust HOA actions. If my battle can help others win theirs, then all the stress and expense was worth it. The property values in Desert Rose Estates have actually increased since the scandal and reforms. Turns out, people are willing to pay more to live in a community with a transparent, accountable HOA rather than one with unchecked board authority. The neighborhood's reputation recovered and even improved. We're now seen as a community that cleaned house and fixed its problems rather than one that swept them under the rug. I still work as an environmental engineer, but my focus has shifted more toward water resources and sustainable residential design. My personal experience gave me insights that purely academic study never could. I understand the importance of water rights not just as an abstract legal concept, but as something that real people fight for and depend on. It's made me better at my job. The vegetable garden I maintained throughout the conflict has grown into something more ambitious. I've expanded it, added fruit trees, and even installed a small greenhouse. The consistent water supply from the spring allows me to grow things year-round that would be impossible for most desert gardeners. I've turned it into a demonstration site of sorts, showing what's possible with proper water management and sustainable practices. I've taught weekend workshops on desert gardening and water conservation, free to any neighbors who want to attend. It's become popular, with people coming from all over Paradise Valley to learn. Some of the same people who once resented my spring now appreciate the knowledge I'm sharing. Education and openness have done more to build community than any amount of forced sharing would have. Tom Mitchell and I have actually become good friends. His own spring-fed irrigation system, while smaller than mine, has given him appreciation for what I was protecting. We sometimes sit on his patio or mine, having a beer and talking about water flow rates, sprinkler efficiency, and the particular challenges of desert landscaping. He's admitted several times that he was wrong to side with Patricia, and I've long since forgiven him. The legal precedent from my case has been cited in other Arizona HOA disputes. James keeps me updated when he sees it referenced in court filings. It's gratifying to know that my fight established clearer boundaries for HOA authority regarding private water sources. Other homeowners won't have to start from scratch arguing what I already proved. I've also become more involved in local water conservation efforts beyond just my property. I serve on a volunteer advisory board for Paradise Valley's water management planning. My experience with spring water systems and my engineering background have proven valuable in discussions about sustainable water use in our growing desert communities. The spring continues to flow, season after season, year after year. It's a constant in my life, a daily reminder of what I fought for and won. Every morning when I check the system, seeing the flow meter register another day of steady supply, I feel grateful. Grateful for the resource, grateful for the legal rights that protect it, grateful for the community that has grown around mutual respect rather than forced compliance. Patricia Hendricks moved out of state after completing her probation. I heard she went to Texas, though I don't know for sure and don't particularly care. Her legacy in Desert Rose Estates is one of caution, a story told to new residents about what happens when HOA power goes unchecked and personal interest masquerades as community benefit. The new board has been excellent. They're transparent, cautious about spending, and respectful of property rights. They focus on actual community needs like maintaining common areas and organizing social events, rather than trying to control every aspect of how people live in their own homes. It's what an HOA should be. My legal costs, even after reimbursement, still totaled several $1,000s that I paid out of pocket. But I've never regretted it. Some things are worth fighting for, and property rights are one of them. The cost of giving in would have been far higher in the long run, not just financially but in terms of precedent and principle. The irrigation system I've built and maintained has become a point of pride. It's efficient, sustainable, and entirely legal. I've documented its design and performance thoroughly, and I've published articles in engineering journals about spring-fed residential irrigation systems in arid climates. It's contributed to broader professional knowledge, which feels like a good use of what I learned through necessity. I still get occasional inquiries from developers wanting to buy my property. I politely decline every time. This is my home, my spring, my garden, and my victory. It's not for sale at any price. The value it holds for me goes far beyond money. The relationship between me and the broader community has settled into something comfortable. I'm known as the guy who stood up to the HOA and won, which carries a certain respect. I'm also known as someone who'll help neighbors with water system questions, share vegetables from my garden, and generally contribute positively to the community. It's a good reputation to have. Looking at my property now, with its lush landscaping, productive garden, and smoothly functioning irrigation system, it's hard to remember the anger and stress of those months of conflict. But the memory serves a purpose. It reminds me to stay vigilant, to know my rights, and to never assume that authority figures have those rights as their priority. The spring that started all this trouble continues to be my favorite feature of the property. On hot Arizona summer days, I sometimes just sit and listen to the water flowing through the system, a quiet sound that speaks of abundance in the desert. It's a gift of geology and hydrology, and I'm its grateful steward. My story has had an ending that I can live with. Justice was served, reforms were enacted, relationships were rebuilt, and my rights remain intact. Not every HOA battle ends this well, which is why I continue to advocate and help others when I can. Everyone deserves what I fought for: the right to enjoy their property within the bounds of reasonable law, free from overreach and corruption. The irrigation system runs on, the spring flows steady, and life in Desert Rose Estates continues. I've learned that standing up for what's right isn't always easy or popular, but it's always worth it. And I've learned that property rights, once surrendered, are hard to reclaim. Better to defend them from the start, no matter the pressure to give in. My name is Lucas Zimmerman. I live at 4782 Desert Rose Drive in Paradise Valley, Arizona. I own my property, my irrigation system, and the water rights to the spring that flows beneath my land. And nobody, not Patricia Hendricks, not any HOA board, not any developer, will ever take that away from me. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.